All right, everybody, welcome to the another session of our Advanced Computing webinar series. We have a couple of training programs, our summer institutes, and then this new series, which are higher level presentations that we're doing on a monthly basis. So today we have a talk by Rick Wagner on cheap and fair data practices. And Rick has been at SDSC for quite some time with a short break working with the Globus people. And he's got a background in physics and also management of our HPC systems and then everything high tech. He's our Chief Technology Officer. So with that, Rick, I'll turn it over to you. You can expand on that if you want. And thank you so much for attending, everybody, and Rick for doing this presentation. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, and thank you to all of you for showing up. And Mary, it's great to be here. So first thing for everybody, I think Mary explained my background, classic computational science and data management interests, and that's led to the recommendations and architecture that we're going to talk about today. If you have questions, raise your hand, put something in the chat. Mary or Cindy will get my attention. I'd rather answer questions as we go along because they tend to be related to a particular part in the presentation. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Before I do, I have a boilerplate bit of humor. If I receive any notifications that are personally or professionally embarrassing, please ignore them as best you can. I don't think I will, but you never know what your alerts are set to, because today I'm going to be sharing my entire screen just because I'm going to be doing some hands-on to demonstrate what we're talking about. So what are we talking about? Well, this is what I call the cheap and fair serverless research data repository architecture. And this is motivated by my experience in both working for a group like Globus that provides a data management service and running a systems team, and also working directly with a lot of research projects and thinking about large scale projects have the ability to deploy massive solutions. But, if we think about the long tail of science that SDSC has been really strong in, is how do you build up the fair research, the fair data practices that I'll explain if you haven't heard of them. How do we provide projects with the ability to implement more of the fair practices earlier without requiring them to operate a huge data management solution? So the outline for today, I just have a couple of sections in the slide deck that you've already received, basically why I came up with this, what's its architecture, and then I'm going to do some hands-on because rather than make it very abstract, I'd like to show you what it takes to implement this architecture. It's intended to be very simple, and I'm borrowing a lot from something that Andrea Zonka and I did for the Gateways conference this year. So I'm reusing materials for that so you can actually see the mechanisms that are used. Something I'd like to point out is that this does not require any particular type of code or service or anything to be deployed. It's just that it's good sometimes to have a concrete implementation to look at, like a reference implementation. So talk about it. We'll set up some stuff that involve the services we'll use, namely GitHub pages and working with a Globus collection. And then I'll give you some more background. So I scaffold you in terms of understanding what's necessary to implement some of these fair data practices. And then we're going to go in and create the rest of our repository. So with that, and then I've got some notes here that say time permitting, we may not get all the way through it. And actually, there's some other resources that have become more available to us in terms of interactive computing that support the serverless or static site model, as it's called, that we can leverage. All right, so what is this that we're talking about in terms of the cheap and fair architecture, and why was it created? Well, one thing is, like, there's a PERC paper. It's very short. It's got large images. So if you want a quick read, you can look up cheap and fair, Zonka and Wagner. Those are kind of two unique enough names that it's easy to find. And the motivation was a project that this had been percolating in the back of my mind, but Andrea Zonka and Julian Burrill work on the Cosmic Microwave Background S4 project, and they had a data repository that they were operating on a Linux server and they had to maintain it and it was challenging to update. And I got into a conversation with Andre about what were the use cases that the data repository needed to support. And he's like, well, we've got some public data sets. We've got some data sets that need to be private to either the teams that are producing them or the broader collaboration. It should be very easy to access the data sets. We want to be able to download them, load them over HTTPS. We want to be able to transfer them to other supercomputing centers. Some of them are very small, some of them are very large. And we want to ensure that in the future, we've got the metadata and the structure in place so that we can, publish them to other repositories or reuse them. And oh, by the way, we're all a bunch of scientists trying to do this, and we don't really know how to operate these things and scale them. And I was like, I've got a solution. If you're willing to work with me, we can test it out. So let's get into a little of background on why I approached it this way. Is when it comes to the data repository space, there's kind of this missing middle. It's like if you want to find a solution, try and go into a space where there isn't something. And so in the large scale on-prem solutions, and one that should be on here is iRods, but Dataverse, DSpace, iRods, if you talk with even the iRod staff, which is a group that started here in San Diego and then moved across the country, these are large solutions. These are something that libraries at universities or very large research institutes operate like one of. So they're a very large lift. They often take, start with an FTE and maybe add more. And so it's a lot of effort to implement these really complete, robust solutions. And then it's even more effort if you want to customize and adapt them. On the other side of it, you've got these really great solutions like Zenodo or Dryad, which universities like the University of California support, where you can publish your data sets. Figshare is another example. Like these are ones where they're free. Sometimes some of them are supported institutionally, but they're fixed features. You can't really have your landing page, your logo, your fonts everywhere. You can basically tweak it within some limited space, and some of them have some is private or restricted data solutions, but most of them are largely open data solution because that's the service they provide. And on the slides, there's this really good chart for these repositories, like what they provide and things like that. So there's either operate a bunch of stuff or, accept like a limited set of features that's hard to customize and may not work for you, et cetera. So if we think about what a data repository is, this is my definition, but I think that I would be willing to argue for this definition with, data repository curators and other experts within the library and curation space, is that a data repository is a set of data sets that are organized and accessible from a collection, something that's hosting the data, that is described and discoverable within a catalog. And for those of you who, are of a certain age, you might remember the card catalog, right? That's where you go and you pull out the thing and you look up by author or subject. But nowadays we do it online. So you have a catalog. And then these things are managed by a policy, like a retention policy. If you've got books and magazines or other periodicals that no one is accessing, well, maybe you don't retain them forever. Maybe you put them on microfiche or tape or whatever it is. Or maybe, you have some things that are only accessible by some people. So these are the set of policies. And I would also say that the quality, if we go to any repository, what we would say is a good repository is what policies they choose and how well and consistently they're implemented. Right? It's like it's amazing how useful a good data repository can be if things are just discoverable, easily accessible in a way that's clearly described, and the rules are laid out in a way that you can understand and are followed consistently. So data sets in a collection, discoverable in a catalog with clear policies that are well implemented. All right, so how do we translate to the serverless research data repository? So we start with some nuts and bolts. This is a little bit reductionist, but I think it makes sense. That if you have a folder just a literal folder for a given data set. You put all of the files for that data set into the folder. This works really well with the storage systems we deal with in research computing, right? It's like this folder is a data set. I can easily tar or zip or basically archive that folder. I can take a manifest of the files and get a checksum and size and reference to that. This structure also works really well with tools like Bagit, which is the standard used for data movement for other archives. And then you have a collection. You basically come up with some sort of file or folder structure that works within the overall with your data sets. Maybe you have data releases, maybe you've got them organized by topic, and things like that. So you've got data sets. Each data set is in a folder. It gives you a single point to say this is a data set. And then you've got a collection, and the collection provides the access and structure. And the nice thing about this when you use tools like Globus is it allows you to assign permissions and access controls at the data set level. And then the collection as a whole is basically like your reference at the, like this folder and below is the collection. Now, this does have a very specific, file system, POSIX file system structure to it, because that's what we work with in research computing a lot. There's other things when you think about object stores, but if you have a HTTPS URL path, it can be applied to that. It doesn't work as well when you talk about databases or other ways to store data. So it has limitations, but if you're working with files a lot, this works. So here's your data sets, here's your collections. Then you've got the catalog, right? In the case of what we're going to use for our catalog is most of you have probably heard of GitHub, and I'm guessing most of you likely work with it. GitHub has the ability to produce pages where you start with a markdown file. That's the wiki-like syntax where you can edit a file within a repository and leverage the site generator, which is usually a tool like Jekyll, as it's known, to produce a set of static HTML files. This is something that almost feels like going backwards for a lot of us because we grew up on the web building our own sites. Well, now you do that. Things have gotten a lot simpler, right? And the nice thing about this is this structure you see here in this code snippet or the screenshot, this structure can be used to automate the creation of the metadata that gets embedded even in machine-readable formats in the page. Because one of the guidelines for fair data, as it's implemented in terms of like persistent IDs, like DOIs, is every data set needs a landing page. It doesn't have to be complex. It doesn't have to be a lot. It just has to be a landing page. And so the more easily you can say, how do I create these simple markdown files or other pages that can be accessible on the web, the more quickly you can start to make them discoverable and reusable, even within your own research projects. And then, of course, you have policies, permissions, retention, and metadata standards and the like, which is like who can access a data set at any given time. And remember, you can have a public page describing the data without making the data itself discoverable. One thing about this model is it does assume that your data sets, you're okay with having a public catalog. There are ways to have private catalogs or portions of your catalog be private, but that's a separate topic that we don't quite have time to go into in this webinar. All right, so that's a bunch of words. Let's turn this into more of a graphical thing. So imagine that you are a data steward for your project and you want to do something where you're not operating stuff, you are configuring things. So you would go and configure a Globus guest collection. And it doesn't have to be Globus. This can be applied to a lot of other ways to host data. Globus is just ubiquitous. We use it and it works well for this model. So your data sets are stored on some storage system, maybe an NFS server, maybe a supercomputer, maybe some other resource in your lab, maybe it's in S3, but it's exposed through Globus guest collection. And you set things like the permissions. They could all be public for your data sets. They could be one where you have limited groups for some and public for others. Then you have you generate markdown files with a list of your data sets and then individual landing pages. GitHub takes over and makes the catalog. This is very scalable. You've got operations teams running the Globus endpoints, hopefully maintaining your storage, and GitHub's operating all this. Once you configure it, if you don't need to make any changes, you can largely, I would say, not forget about it, but not worry about it. There's no single service that you as the data steward are thinking about. If you are one of the people operating this, you're more likely to be, unless you're from GitHub, which I don't think anyone is, you're worried about this side. How do I maintain the storage and the collection? But the data steward is the one maintaining the organizational structure of the data and the permissions. And then you've got the researcher on the other side who can now find your data through the catalog and access it directly through Globus over HTTPS or Globus Connect. And then it's kind of amazing. Once you have these two mechanisms, you can access it through a portal, a notebook, a CLI. Basically, you can start to build on top of it, and we'll touch on that a little bit. A moment. All right, so let's define cheap. Cheap here is minimizing project costs, right? Serverless, no systems maintenance, right? If you've got an allocation on a system that provides you the storage and the Globus X collection, you're not paying for that. You're not paying for the GitHub pages. If you are paying for something like you're purchasing storage, usually those are something where you can scale the amount of storage you purchase based on the data that you have. You don't have to have a large upfront cost, relatively speaking. And Globus guest collections do come with a subscription, but these slides are probably outdated. It was at least 70% of R1 universities that had one, and most of our HPC centers that people use, like SDSC, have subscriptions and can provide guest collections for you. But again, you can apply this to other resources besides Globus. All right, very briefly, the FAIR principles, because this kind of guides it, right? Many of you have heard about the FAIR principles: findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reuse. Those are the 4 high-level ones. And then there's 15 specific ones below that. And there's a couple of references here, the Go FAIR and the original paper, as to what do these mean. So how is the SDS, the Serverless Research Data Repository model, FAIR? On the landing pages, you've got human, the website, and machine-readable metadata. The data sets are listed in a catalog, basically your GitHub pages sites, and you assign unique identifiers scoped to your project. It's accessible because the data and landing pages are all available over HTTPS. Globus has the transfer mechanism, but really, to be fair, you want it to be in a more standardized format, so it should also have access over HTTPS. Access control: if you have restricted data sets, use OAuth and OIDC, a standard layer that anyone can implement. And you've got persistent landing pages on GitHub. So it's like you do have to have some responsibility as a data steward not to mess up or change things arbitrarily. The interoperable: these data you post should be in a format used widely by your community. And the metadata is based on schema.org and DataSite, 2 widely used formats for data discovery. Reusable, same thing. So this is what I mean, is we try to tick the boxes of the FAIR data practices in the simplest way possible so that projects can start using them sooner. All right, last slide before the demo. And one of the things that we can now do, and for future stuff that we're working on, is even for restricted data sets, the interactivity within the browser has really grown. We've all seen really amazing sites where you can interact with data sets. We can now also log in to the browser, receive tokens, and potentially interact with restricted data sets in the browser itself. And there's some stuff I'll show at the end about that. All right. So let me show you what this looks like in practice so that you have an idea of how you would do it. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm borrowing a lot from what Andre and I did for the Gateways conference. And we set up this GitHub org, cheap and fair. And under that, we have several repositories. In here is the Gateways repository, which has several notebooks that I'll be accessing that describe the steps if you're working through this, to create the initial repository, how to use our template and stuff like that. You don't have to use it this way. You can do it in different ways, but this is the one that I'm using. So we have here, and I've cloned this to my desktop, and I'm now running it in Jupyter Lab. When we first did this, we had a Jupyter Hub instance, but I just started this on my desktop. So what we need to do is create a GitHub repository that we can enable GitHub pages on. So to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is go to the cheap and fair template repository, which is right here. And a template repository, you don't fork it, you use the template and you create a new repository. And I'm going to put this under my account, RP Wagner. And to make it simple, I'm going to use the exact same name, because in the repository, or in the Jupyter notebooks, there's some stuff we need to do, like clone it. And if I give it a different name, it makes it a little more complicated. So it creates the repository. Here now it's under my name, my GitHub username. There we go. And I'm going to go to settings. And I'm going to make sure that pages, so any repository you have, you can have GitHub pages, and you can either build them using a custom action, or you can configure it to build from a branch. And this is typically what people do. And I'm going to go down here and enforce HTTPS, because I have a custom domain name. And if I don't do that, it tends to not put the S on. So now we've got this building. And if we go back to the top, we'll see that it's building. And so this is automatically building the pages from like this markdown file, which if you've seen markdown before, you can get up pages, you're familiar with this. So this will become the top level page of our repository. And for convenience, I'm also going to go here and click use your website. So there's rickwagner.io is my personal domain. And then it's got the repo name. And so now I'll have this convenient link that once this is done, in just a second, if you want, you can also watch this under the Actions tab. It's very exciting. By the way, the ability to deploy and build code through GitHub Actions is very, very useful. Green checkbox yet? Almost. Overconfident. I'm going to click here. Normally this goes, okay. So now if I refresh this page, there we go. We have a landing page for our portal. It's got some summary information, but the data sets are empty because we haven't built that yet. We'll do that next. All right, so going in, I'm going to clone that repository. This is just a GitHub command that that's very odd. Okay, I have no idea why we got the weird characters, but I do know now that we have cloned this repository. And so somewhere on my the file system on my laptop, it's there. We go over here to Globus. So let's just make sure that we're in the right space here. So in Globus, I'm already logged in. I've joined the correct group. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff in the favor of time. One of the things that you'll do as part of this demonstration is, what if you have restricted data sets? Well, you create a group. And so in Globus, you can create groups that you can later use to manage people who have certain roles or who have different access permissions. So I've already created a group. It's kind of like pre-baking the cake in the oven for a cooking show. And what you'll notice here is that because I'm going to automatically I want to reference this group later to tell people what they want to join, I go here and I copy the group ID, and I'm creating a configuration file for my repository. And I create this COMO file, and then I've got a guest collection. For the purposes of the tutorial we gave, we pre-created them. Here, I have created my own guest collection, the SDSC Advanced Computing Cheap and Fair Webinar collection, and it's got different attributes, one of which is it has a UUID, which is the specific identifier for it, and it's got the domain, which is a unique domain that you can use to access the data over HTTPS. So coming down here, I need to add that, and I'm going to update the configuration file. I'm going to get the UUID down here and add it. And I'm going to get the prefix to the domain, which is this string here. And what this is going to do is there's a file copy datasets in the cheap and fair repository. If we go look at it here, this is what we wanted to help give people is tools like this, which is simple scripts to do stuff like copy the datasets between places or create the manifests, which will be lists of files that have checksums and stuff like that. So you can look at those Python files for examples of how to automate this work for your own projects. Okay, where are my Jupyter notebooks? There we go. And so once I update my configuration file, this is all local. Now I've got the identifier for the repository, the collection, and there's some public data sets that were examples that we're going to reuse. And this is something you can adapt as a pipeline to copy data sets, like say if they're produced from a simulation, into your collection. So then I want to log into Globus. And this is going to allow me to log into Globus and store a token locally that I can then reuse for interacting with the Globus services. Okay, so now I've got tokens. These will be stored on my laptop, and I can now, this is going to automatically copy the data set from the source folder to my new collection. So let's look over, making my life harder. Okay, so let's look in the file manager. So right now, I have no data in my collection, but I'm going to copy this data set that is the CMB data set. And it's running. We see we have an activity over here that is running. And in just a moment, it will finish. Oh, and the other thing that this did is Globus now, when data gets transferred between two Globus collections, Globus tracks the checksum and the size of the data. And you can use that to automatically create a manifest. And so if we navigate into here, we can see that there is now this CMB manifest.json file. And in this again, this comes from the transfer information. You have the name of the file relative to the folder it's in, a URL that you can reference in that, whether it's public or private. Remember, just because you have the URL doesn't mean you can necessarily get it. It has the SHA-256 checksum and the size in bytes. This is really critical when you're moving data between systems. Worked with data and systems for a lot of years. No matter how well you want to ensure that data does not get corrupted or modified, having a manifest is critical. So if we go back and refresh our list of files, you'll see we now have a datasets folder. We have the CMB dataset. And down here, we have the manifest file because this is local on my laptop. But one of the last steps that, and why we got those tokens earlier by logging in, is from our laptop, it pushed the manifest up. So this means that you can, from your laptop, run tools like this, copy data between collections, generate these manifests, and send them to another place for storage. In this case, we keep it alongside the files. And we think that's really useful and important just in terms of a workflow. Oh, and then here's the starting of it, what I just showed you. But I wanted you to see, like, this is actually a file. It's really here, and it's stored up there. All right, so now let's do all of them. So all of the data sets get copied up. So this is going to go in the background, and what we'll see is if we go up a level and we do a refresh, we'll see that more of the data sets are getting moved up. So first, what we're doing is we're populating our collection. And this in and of itself, if you have a well-organized collection like this and you set the permissions on it, now you can share this with others within your research group, and they'll be like, oh yeah, you know, like we know that these data is here and it's in this folder and stuff like that. Okay, and as it goes along, we see that it's been adding for each of the data sets, it's been adding the manifest, and we're down to almost the last one. Is it? Yes. So all of them are here. 4 data sets, or sorry, 5 data sets: CMB, spectra, dust, dusting spectra, and sync. All right. So we can also generate links to the data. This is one of the nice things you can do, because you can embed these into your landing pages, and now it's the same link that we're looking at over here. And we could drill in. Okay, now the last step for setting up the collection is to create the permissions. And again, just because to make our lives easier, I'm going to add a link here that opens up the permissions tab. So this is the collection, and these are the default permissions. This is a particular service account that owns the endpoint, and this is me. We look at our... So what we want to do is we're going to create 2 public data sets. Oh no, 3 public data sets. Dust sync and dust sync spectra we'll set as public. CMB and CMB public, or CMB spectra, are read-only to the group. So let's do our public ones. So if I go in here, oops, and I select dust, I can say public. There's very little reason. Oh yeah, and usually you cannot create anonymous rights. You don't want arbitrary people to add data to stuff. So add permission, public to dust. And then we want to add public to dust sync spectra. And then we want to add another. And then finally sync. We want public. And then for CMB, you can make it, you can share with users or groups. We're going to go with group. We're going to select a group, SDSC. Down here, cheap and fair webinar, read permission. And then one more, which is the CMB spectra group, select a group, and cheap and fair webinar. Oops. Did I? Okay, so let's check. I think I make sure I didn't skip something. All right, so then when we're done, we can review these. So this is the other nice thing about using an interface like Globus. It makes it clear who you've shared what with. You can go to the top level of your collection, and you can look at, here's the ones that I get because, you know, I own this, but these groups, this group has access to this path, and the other ones are public. So now I can share those with anybody and they can see them. For these, people need to either request to join or be invited to the group. And you have different ways to control how people are in groups. You can also, for example, delegate the management of these permissions to others using roles like access manager, and people can also monitor the activity and things like that. But we're not going to do that right now. We're going to go back and look at our collection. There. Okay.
And
so
we have a question for you.
Oh, yeah.
You want me to read it to you, or
Can
can
the
you?
user automatically scan the manifest for inconsistency, or does the so the question is, can the user automatically scan the manifest for inconsistency, or does the user always need to manually inspect it? So when you're generating the manifest, if you're the data steward creating it and you wanted to compare what Globus produced versus the data itself, you would need to have a mechanism by which you went and ran the checksums yourself. One of the reasons that we wanted to show a method where you can use the Globus API for this is because sometimes these are very large data sets and it can be challenging to log into, say, an HPC system or others, and go through and manually run and generate the manifest. Because Globus checksums data as part of its transfer, you can have a lot of trust in what the API provides. Now, when the user is accessing the data and they want to compare it, one of the tools that we're going to show in just a moment is the ability to when you download the data, there are tools that will automatically compare the manifest to the data itself. And so that's probably the simplest route, is to use one of those tools. The one that we're going to use is called BDBag, but you could easily write your own. But at some point, unfortunately, Globus doesn't have a mechanism for you to re-trigger or regenerate a manifest. You could build services that did, but then it gets to more complex use cases and stuff like that, where now you're operating services. So there are tools that will automatically check the manifest for you. Okay, so we've got the permissions. And now I think we need to go back to these slides for just a moment. Where did I put my PDF? All right, you get a sip of water, and I'll try to make this quick because we've got a couple more hands-on things that I want to show you about building the site and that step about accessing the data and checking the validity of the manifest. But I wanted to touch on identifiers and landing pages really quick because they're a critical part of when people start talking about fair data, and it can get really complex, and I don't want people to be intimidated or deterred because identifiers can be a contentious topic. And you've heard of DOIs, digital object identifiers. Those are used very commonly for us to reference papers, and even more commonly now to reference data sets. First of all, it's all about namespaces and resolvers. Basically, I'm Rick. When I'm in a room, if there's not another Rick, it's really clear who I am. But, I also have a social security number in the United States because the government wants to make sure that, well, I want to make sure that I only pay taxes for me, for example. I'd rather not be paying taxes for all the Ricks in America. And so it really is about what context you're referring to something by using a given string. Identifiers don't need to be semantically meaningful. If you're generating data sets for your own projects, I'd go easy on, I would avoid trying to have a lot of identifiers that are like, have all the parameters of a given simulation or things embedded in them. Generate a unique number or something like that. And in the same way, I just talked about myself being Rick and having a social security number and a driver's license with a number and a passport with a number. Data sets can have multiple identifiers, right? So start with one that you assign and then add more as needed. Because if you never get to the point where this data set needs a DOI, don't go through the effort of it. But by adopting these standards, you make it a lot easier when you do want to export it and create a DOI. I'd be very cautious as well about using URLs as an identifier for a data set. URLs, now you've got to maintain the domain. You should have a landing page there. Strictly speaking, you don't need to, but it gets really messy if somebody sees a URL or what looks like a URL referring to a data set, and then they go to the page and it's not really about that data set, which is actually like, you're allowed to do that. So be very cautious about using URLs as data set identifiers. These are some definition terms that you can look at in the slides. I borrowed this from some content that I helped co-write about guiding these. Essentially, identifiers are just strings that we use that are either locally unique, things that your project understands, or globally unique. Persistent identifiers, the ones that we tend to care about long term when we're making data sets, you know, a data set stay around. But they all rely on resolution services. So DOIs rely on the data set, the data site resolver, which is tied to the handle system. And it's that resolution service that really makes them useful. More importantly, for the catalog, it's about having a landing page. This is every data set gets a landing page. And this kind of tells you, like, a data set can be a single file, it can be multiple files, but needs to have a landing page with specific amounts of information, which this references to knowing what they are. They're not a lot. It's basically who created it when, what's it called, title, stuff like that. But it does need to be in human and machine readable format. And the way we do that is you have a page that says the information in a clearly understandable way. And then we embed JSON LD or linked data inside of the page so that tools like Google Dataset Search and others can scrape it. And that's that site generation process going from Markdown to this is how that's created. There's two metadata standards that you need to know. One is DataSite and one is schema.org. DataSite is the metadata standard that's used as the baseline for DOIs. So if you want your data set to eventually have a DOI, it's good to know the minimums. Schema.org is used for Google Dataset Search, which is very good. And there's this nice crosswalk that's good to know so that you know what field in DataSite translates to which field in schema.org. Schema.org is also how you describe recipes and other stuff on the web. So it's really complex and there's a lot of different standards out there. But fortunately for dataset search, you can scope it down. So what I recommend is have the minimum terms that you need on your page, and describe them in a way that's clearly understandable, and then embed the schema.org inside so that tools like Google Dataset Search can understand it, and then extend it with the project-specific metadata from whatever, ad hoc or specific standards that you use to make it more widely available to your community. So here's a set of recommended practices you can read. Is basically do assign a unique identifier and make sure that every landing page has the necessary metadata, and that you have public landing pages even when the data is not. Put in a license. Creative Commons is good for a lot of data, or you can use some other open source license. If you do assign a DOI, make sure that you maintain the landing page. You don't want something where the DOI eventually points to nowhere. The data site will eventually ask you where it's gone. And you don't have to keep the data, you just keep the landing page. All right, so that was kind of fast, but I wanted to get it out there so you had the slides and you knew about it. So let's get through the last demos about creating the catalog and validating and accessing the data. And then I'll show you some other stuff, probably not specifically this, and then try and retain time for questions. All right, so we got the data into our catalog. Sorry, we got the data into our collection, but what we haven't done is done much with our catalog, right? We still don't see our data sets listed here, so we're not fair yet. So we want to create markdown pages, and we look, we've got a few pages that are more like about and stuff like that. We don't have anything specific to the data sets itself. So what we're going to do is create a file by hand that basically creates a template page. And we're going to run this tool create markdown.py. And what it's going to do is it's basically going to read the manifests and create pages for each of the data sets, because we all have these here. See, it's reading all of them, and it's going to create tables. And down at the bottom, okay. And again, all this is local. It's all, you can see these all got created. So these are all on my laptop. We're going to need to push those to GitHub. But it also created pages here that are linking to what will eventually become these HTML pages. I can't remember why I set that, but we're going to commit some changes and we're pushing. So this is the other nice thing is you're maintaining your catalog using the tools that you might commonly use for work, basically Git, and you're editing your catalog in ways that you could modify it by hand if needed, or you can write scripts to generate the markdown that's necessary. So going back to the repository, we see that we're building the site again. And now we look at our index page. There's the update. We now have links under our data set. So we've got a single landing page or a single list in our catalog pointing to the data sets. And then inside of each is a data set page. We look at CMB. There is now a landing page or the markdown source for the landing page that has the basics of it. It says that it's a data set that'll help with generating the JSON LD. It's got some URLs. It says that if you, this one, sorry, I thought we had links that said that you need to join the right group. But then it's got links to the individual files. Some stuff are just CSVs and some information. So that we finished building, we finished building. So now we go and refresh. We now have a minimally functional data repository. We've got a list of our data sets. I don't know why it only did 5 of them. Sorry, I'm going to have to double check our code. Anyways, this is a landing page. And if I click on any of these, it will take me to Globus, and now I could download it. And if I wanted to, I could look at that bits file. And oh, here we have some images. So I can actually look at the images, literally an image. And you can embed these images into your page if you want to. And if we do one more thing, we're going to look inside the page in the HTML that was generated. And down here, we see this. This is the machine readable aspect. This is really where using just a few steps and tools, you're able to take your information from what might be files on a supercomputer storage system, going through a Globus collection of GitHub pages to putting them on par with any other data set on the web. And so here's our JSON LD with its reference to the schema.org metadata standard and the blanks that I really should fill in about author name and stuff like that, and when things were generated. So going back to our to-do page, let's test the portal. So we're already looked inside, but what we can do is if we, this is a tool for Google dataset search where it can validate the structured data that you put inside the page. And so it's going and it's querying the page, and then it's going to show whether or not it discovered the structured metadata that meets the schema.org standard. And then it's like, by the way, you should add a license page. And if you go to Google, and actually I'll do this in a private browser, CMB S4 Planck data. What you'll notice is that this was an anonymous search and it has already discovered all of the data sets. So the CMBS4 data portal, Google has been crawling it and now knows where the data sets are. If you were to put in more specific requests, it can find them. So that's how we know that, we've built it in the way that we intended. All right, so I mentioned BD-Bag and the ability to download data and validate the checksum. So BD-Bag is a tool that is regularly maintained, uses the Baggett format, and it has the ability for relying on the remote file manifest to go and retrieve URLs and pull either public or private data down. So make sure we're in the right space. We're going to create so the data is not currently on my laptop, but now I've got this empty folder sync here on my system. And I'm going to use the manifest file and tell BD-Bag to create an empty bag, which we can just look in both places. So there, it created an empty bag using the manifest file. It basically populated stuff in the Baggett format, and Baggett uses this thing called a fetch file, which has the URLs that are in the manifest, the size of the files, and then there's a separate manifest file with the checksums. And if you use the materialize command, it will go and get the files. When it goes and gets the files, it will checksum each of the files. So this is how a user doesn't have to deal with the individual files or deal with the individual checksums. And what I will say is when you make a mistake in, like, you're preparing for a tutorial and stuff like that, and you accidentally pull down a bunch of HTML pages, you'll see the checksum fail. But now when we look at it, there is now a data folder. And in the data folder is guaranteed to be, based on the checksum and size, all of the data for that data set. So this means that you can now distribute the manifest file, which is here, to your users, and then give them some basic instructions on using BD-Bag to basically retrieve the data sets. And then you can also do this using the Python SDK. And if you wanted to, you could go through and put a token into the BD-Bag keychain, so you can actually use this for the restricted data sets as well. Sync was public, if you recall, so you can do it with restricted data. So there's other examples in here that if you wanted to look through them, you can, like, how to add images and things like that. There's also the ability to add visualization pages where you can add pages that render some stuff, and you can even do that for restricted data as well. But on that topic, one of the last things I wanted to show everyone in terms of things that excite me and I think should be exciting to the general community. There we go. So I'll finish this up in 4 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So you've got your portal now, and sorry, let me bring that back up. That was the cheap and fair template. So you've got this portal, and it's great for enabling data discovery, and it's great for distributing your data sets, but it lacks interactivity. And one of the challenges with developing interactive tools is most of us know Python. It's not guaranteed we all know Python, but a lot of us know Python. What a lot of us don't know, myself in particular, are JavaScript and TypeScript, the primary tools for developing interactive applications on the web. But there are ways to do that now in Python, in particular using Jupyter. So there is a format for producing applications to run in the browser called WebAssembly, and Pyodide is a Python interpreter that runs inside the browser. So I just clicked over here earlier today that you can use the interactive version of Python here, and I can do things like import NumPy. NumPy is available. There's a huge number of packages available, including NumPy, matplotlib. Of course, I can't do anything with matplotlib right now because I'm in just the command line terminal. but it gives you the idea that, AstroPy, scikit-learn, huge number of applications or libraries, including HDF5 and SQLite and stuff like that. And to make this even more useful, the Jupyter community has built a tool called Jupyter Lite that basically takes all the Python aspects that are needed to run Jupyter Notebook or Jupyter Lab into your browser. And so we can go here. This is the demo site for Jupyter Lite. And, you can run the classic, make a plot, and this is running fully in the browser using Jupyter Lite, using Pyodide and the extended stack. I've worked out with some students on pulling data into this environment, and I'll skip over. So I'm working on some documentation on how you can build custom Pyodide environments with your applications. But this is where, in this example, we've hosted some data, including data from weather balloons. And so here, I'm going to load some data from a weather balloon that the Scripps Institute of Oceanography has worked on, or data they've collected. And once these execute, it is your browser. So some computation is a little bit slower than others, but hopefully this finishes, they tend to go all at once. And the basic answer is here, you now have the ability to, and you can refer to external data and pull it in from the collection. So, we're working on some tools to help bring that data into the browser more easily from the collection so that, you can basically build these interactive sites, extending your, static catalog to a richer one that allows you to do interactive analysis using languages most of us know, like Python. So as this runs in the background, for some reason going slower than usual, and could be, maybe I'll stop it. Okay. With that, I think it is time for me to stop chattering and answer questions as best I can.